The humanitarian crisis in northern Ethiopia is growing worse by the day.
Good morning. This is Informed Perspectives, a cyber power of Tigray media. My name is Mulgita Gabriel, and I am your host today. Today is April 10, 2022. So welcome to our program, to our show. Thank you so much for joining us. Informed Perspectives is a program that would be totally based on informed perspectives, evidence-based information analysis, and no hearsay at all. We bring guests who analyze, discuss world events, and especially things that are very, very relevant to the people of Tigray. As we know, our people are going through a lot of challenges, to say the least, a lot of war crimes, siege, weaponized famine, weaponized starvation, so many. Probably, in my perspective, in my analysis, in my understanding, a genocide is going on in Tigray. So today we will analyze some of what is going on in Tigray vis-a-vis the recent joint report of the Human Rights Watch and the Amnesty International. And I will have a guest who will be discussing that with me. Before that, I would like to bring you to my take. And my take today, as you will see, is going to be focused on these events that have happened this week. And those events are critical, as we will see, to what we are talking about when it comes to the issues surrounding Tigray and its people. So in the past 3 weeks, we have witnessed reports of the most gruesome atrocities on Tigrayans, such as immolation, burning alive of Tigrayans, and reports of heinous war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing committed by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, the Amhara Fano, the Amhara Militia, and the Amhara Special Forces, among others. I think evidences so far show the genocidal intent and actions of these perpetrators of the crimes. We also witness the failure of the Ethio-Tigray truce because of the Ethiopian government's lack of desire to implement even the most basic terms of the agreement, access to humanitarian aid. Nothing is surprising since from the outset, in fact, the Ethiopian government has reneged on its promise of declaring the truce jointly as a negotiated truce with the Tigray government for its own political motives. The road for aid convoys was not open until 2 days ago and continues to be closed. The number of convoys, about 20 in 2 weeks since the truce, is insignificant compared to the need. As we know, telephone, electricity, banking are still not restored. In effect, the blockade is still ongoing, with the government putting preconditions to allow aid delivery to Tigray, which is so unacceptable. On the other hand, encouraging information or news was that there was the markup and passing from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee of S3199 as a bill. As we know, the US government has an executive order to take actions to end the siege and the catastrophic crisis going on in Tigray. The US State Department has a review and classification of Tigray genocide on its desk. Despite this too, despite the existence of the executive order, which allows the US State Department and other US agencies, government agencies to take action, there are no tangible actions to end the Tigray siege and to end Tigray genocide. So in my take, I would like to call to action. One, I would like our friends, our colleagues, and everyone, every Tigrayan and friends of Tigray to continue reaching out to their congressional representatives to support and co-sponsor A3199 and HR 6600, and also to demand the level of support bestowed to Ukraine deservingly to be accorded to Tigray. Thank you so much. Now, I will bring my guest, Professor Mukesh Kapila. Welcome to IP Informed Perspectives, Professor Mukesh.
Thank you, Mulugeta. Good to be here. Thank you for inviting me for this conversation.
Yes, I am so glad that you are here. So today we will be talking about this very important topic, why the joint report by the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International didn't use the term genocide. Before I go there, I think it would be amiss if I fail to introduce you to our listeners and our viewers, Professor Mukesh. Luckily, we had your profile well done from the global symposium that we did in February 4th, 2022. I know your CV is so long. I visited your website, so there is a lot to be learned about you. But briefly, if there are one or two things you would like to highlight for our viewers, especially with respect to your humanitarian work and your work around this, genocide. I know you are an expert in that area. People will read for themselves from this slide. But please, let me invite you to say a few words about yourself.
Well, I think modesty prevents me from saying too much. First is to say that my career has spanned humanitarianism, human rights, as well as the global health fields. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, my life over the last 30, 40 years of professional work has spanned some of the worst situations of conflict and disaster around the world, including and specifically situations like the Darfur genocide, where I was the head of the United Nations there, as well as in positions which have taken me to genocides in Srebrenica, Cambodia, Rwanda, and so on. So sadly, this has been a somewhat accidental study and endeavor for me for most of my professional life.
Yeah, thank you so much. You are right. You are so modest. But I think people, maybe there would be new people who would be watching our program. And for those, I think I have tried to put together briefly a summary of your CV, and that would take them, I think, to places where they can Google you and find even more information about yourself, Professor Mukesh. Actually, the reason this show started is partly also from your suggestion. If you remember, in one of the Twitter space discussions we have had, where I was asking you and the other guests, what should the Tigrayans be doing when it comes to reaching out, to the international community. And what I did recently, you probably have seen it on Twitter, was I did a small poll, a snapshot poll, and I asked people to tell me. I listed I listed what I thought are important for our media to cover, and people responded. About 517 of them responded, actually, and they wanted to hear more about what is going on in Tigray, the crimes that are being committed, 68% of them. And also they wanted to hear from guests like yourself, 15% of them. And as you can see, there were also a lot of people who have made comments answering multiple, because Twitter didn't allow for multiple choices. People were able to give us their information on the comment section. So I am glad that we are doing this, and partly we are also going to be talking about the first issue, which is the crimes being committed as reported by the Human Rights Watch, as well as the Amnesty International. So I will take you to the first question. This report, which is 221 pages, and it has also 7 pages of additional appendix, outlines so many of the, I think, crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity that have been committed in Tigray broadly, but also specifically in Western Tigray. And I just want first to get your reading of the report and what you can say about it, Mukesh.
Yes, thank you. By the way, if I can comment on your previous point, today the world is a hugely noisy place. So what that means is that there are thousands of issues in the world, each clamoring for attention. And all these routes that have been identified are all necessary. So it's not a question of the first option or the second option. It's a question of actually taking all the options simultaneously according to the audience that is to be accessed and according to the opportunities they have to access information and analysis. I'm afraid a lot of continuous and ongoing and repeated work. Now, coming to the issue of the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty report, firstly, they are to be congratulated on this report. I mean, this is the first comprehensive, consolidated report that I have seen ever since the war started. And these are very respectable organizations. They go back a long time, and I remember when I was dealing with the Darfur genocidal situation as the head of the UN in Sudan, Amnesty were extremely useful as one of the first voices to speak up in support when I was able to speak out myself. And they do a lot of very good investigative work. And the report lays out very, very clearly the terrible things that happened in around Tigray. So on that, I think there can be no doubt whatsoever. If there is anyone out there in the world that is in denial, well, I don't know what more is needed to put you out of your denial. There is no question that terrible crimes against humanity, war crimes have been committed, violations of international humanitarian law, and all forms of murders and rapes and abuses and exploitations have taken place, including what the report calls ethnic cleansing. So I think I'm looking forward to unpacking this report with you in the coming minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mukesh. This report, like I said, is very long. I agree with you. I think the fact that it was done jointly between these two international human rights organizations makes it also, I think, more credible in a way. And even, I have seen tweets from staff members of these organizations. I have seen, conversations, interviews by members of this organization. So what I have heard them say that surprised me is, well, we need more independent investigation, more international independent investigation. Can you give me, what do they mean? What do they mean when they say international independent investigation?
Well, I think the two words have to be taken separately. International, of course, because it is very clear that when the terrible acts of crimes against humanity are being committed within a country, the actors of that country can hardly be objective assessors of those acts. So, in theory, crimes should be investigated by the judicial authorities of the country in which the crimes are being committed. But nobody in their right minds would ascribe any credibility to the government of Ethiopia in terms of investigating the crimes that have been committed on its own territory, for which its own agents have been blamed, and in relation to populations, or its own populations, that Tigrayan populations, for example, that it has been unable to protect. So obviously, it has to be international investigations because national authorities are incapable or unwilling to do it. Now, they have to be independent because we live in a highly politicized world. So, for example, the Ethiopian government has used its international positioning to try and win many governments to its cause. It has subverted the African Union, for example. So the African Union of today is simply an agent of the Ethiopian government. It's not really independent. That's why the United Nations had to intervene. However, the United Nations itself is a hostage to certain governments like those of China and Russia, and therefore it's not capable of acting in an independent way. That's why the mechanism of genuinely independent and genuinely international investigations become more and more difficult as a lot of avenues have been closed by international geopolitics. However, that doesn't mean to say they're not impossible.
Yeah, I agree. I think, some of the challenges that they have been mentioning have to do actually with the reluctance, even, denial of access to both Tigray, Western Tigray, and even maybe some parts of the other regions where there have been crimes being committed. And, calling for an independent investigation, independent international investigation that would introduce, I think, some mechanism where access is given, access is provided, access is forced. Somehow, I think it's going to be important.
However,
yes,
if I can add, I think obviously access to the scene of the crimes, which is in and around Tigray, is
yes,
obviously highly desirable. But thankfully, we live in an age where we've got many technologies of remote sensing that are available to us. So, like, for example, Russian war crimes have been detected in Ukraine from a distance. And of course, now the Ukrainian side has got access, that is true. But the actual detection of those war crimes took place from outside. So access is very important, but Ethiopia is not going to give access, at least in the foreseeable future. But that does not mean that we cannot have access using all the technologies and contacts that we have at our disposal. And some of these technologies are pretty smart. So I think those who wish to hide these crimes might have succeeded in an earlier age, but they cannot succeed in today's age.
I think that's well said. Actually, you reminded me of something, Mukesh, that I didn't plan to ask you, but I probably could give some insight towards this. In recent weeks, especially just before the release of this report, we have seen media reports from Ethiopia that show that a university, which its name is Gondar University, which is in the Gondar area, not far away from Western Tigray, was participating in digging up of bodies as part of, I don't know what kind of investigation it is. So how typical, at least in my view, I haven't seen in any university involved in such scale in an ongoing international crime investigation, but the university digging up these bodies. Do you see any precedent, or do you know of anywhere where a university would just involve itself in digging up of bodies?
Well, I mean, obviously, it is a job of forensic pathologists and historians and archaeologists to dig up bodies where appropriate. I'm sorry to say that there are plenty of dishonest academics around the world, whether it is in Gondar or in Canada and the United States, where there are plenty of academics that are available to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. And here in Europe, there are plenty of universities that are reliant on funding of their institutions from extremely dubious sources. We see a lot of Chinese money, for example, being invested in several universities where the sole reason appears to be to subvert independent and scholarship. So I know as academics, we find such a thing absolutely abhorrent, as we also do as doctors, to say that in the name of science and learning can be subverted. But of course, you only have to remind yourself what happened, what the academics and doctors did in the Nazi period to understand how knowledge was subverted. So I'm not surprised that these things are happening now. And within Ethiopia, I'm not surprised at all, because I cannot see that there is any institution left in Ethiopia that is independent of the influence of the genocidal government in Addis Ababa, because these institutions would not be able to survive unless under license by the authorities of the Ethiopian government. I just feel sorry for them. But in the same way that we have now boycotted many institutions of Russia, I feel that many of the dishonest institutions in Ethiopia should be thrown out of international councils, whether it is of international research bodies or international academic networks, because they're a disgrace to the international community in that regard.
Yes. Actually, I have also seen a tweet from Professor Tony Magana, who is familiar with some of these universities, talking about actually even the absence of the skills, the know-how about how to do this. So a university outside of its academic mission, delving into, I think, this type of activities should really, I think, sound the alarm to its funders, international collaborators, like you said. This is I think something we, as academicians, we should condemn, because it's not academic work, as you said. And it goes even to really what I call one, they are losing this impartiality that should keep them trusted by everyone, including their students, their faculty, as well as their collaborators internationally. But beyond that, if they are also, like crossing a red line where, it is not in their purview, and they are playing maybe a cover up for, a regime that is, or forces that are committing this type of crimes, I think that needs to be called out. Now, to go to my next question on this report, are there any sections that kind of really grab your attention? I know, I went through it. I mean, every line, every page is full of details of human catastrophe, crimes after crimes. But if there are some sections where you would like to highlight and maybe discuss briefly, Professor Kapila.
I think, as you say, the report is very detailed and factual. It describes incidents in space and time. And what it indicates to me is not so much a particular section, but the totality of the report. So what it paints, and the value of the report is not in the individual incident or detail, but in the pattern that it paints. When taken in its entirety, it is very clear that the evidence for terrible crimes against humanity and its various subsets are overwhelming, and that these are not isolated incidents here and there, but they are consistent, they are additive, they are holistic, and they point, in my opinion, to an overall strategy, to an overall framework under which these crimes appear to have been committed. That's what's staggering about seeing well over 100 pages altogether of individual incidents and different times and places. It's the ability to see this in its whole. And that, I think this report is the first time actually I've seen such a comprehensive delineation of these, and the links between them are extremely compelling in terms of seeing the overall picture that they paint. They don't use the term, sorry, please
go on.
So they don't use the term genocide, and as your question on the screen says, why not genocide? Now, according to the report, they are not using the word genocide because the displacement, the forced displacement of Tigrayans from their homeland, according to the researchers and writers, don't satisfy the criteria of a genocide, number one. And secondly, they don't call it a genocide because they don't have evidence for the intention behind the crimes in Tigray. But they say that it doesn't mean to say that, they admit that it doesn't mean to say that genocide cannot be ruled out. Now, I happen to disagree with their judgment in some areas, and I can go into that in now if you wish. But the important point is that they do not rule out genocide. It is just that they say that their findings, they cannot substantiate the finding of genocide as per the Genocide Convention. I think they're wrong, but that's their view.
Yeah, I am actually with you on that too, Mukesh. But so one thing that I have, also read and heard from staff members of these organizations who participated in the writing of this report is that they were not, they didn't have enough access to the area, to establish intent, which to me, even the report itself, as you can see it says we will erase you from this land. And as you remember, even, I think way before, kind of last year, right? You remember Mr. Havisto, who was the EU envoy, heard actual officials talking about, wiping out of Tigrayans, for 100 years. So it's not only those statements, but so many reports that we have seen over, the last 15 months, so many events that we have seen, so many tragic crimes that we have seen, and they were supported by what looks like pre-planned statements, pre-planned, activities, actions. So it looks like there has been intent. Can you speak to that?
Okay.
What is in intent that they couldn't establish to call it a genocide?
Yes, let me address that. I think firstly I should say that although I have great respect for both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, obviously they are leaders in their areas. You have to understand that they're also realpolitik organizations. So what that means is that what an organization says, even organizations of the status of Amnesty and HRW, is to some extent colored by tactics, by their understanding of how the world will receive what they say. I had exactly the same battle with Amnesty when I was dealing with Darfur nearly 20 years ago. When even I, as the United Nations coordinator, initially was speaking about ethnic cleansing, then I spoke about genocide, and Amnesty were very reluctant to talk about it. And it wasn't simply for academic reasons of whether or not the lawyers in Amnesty could sign up to that, but because once an organization uses that phrase, they are out on a limb. And these organizations also depend on their funding from a number of different stakeholders, both both private individuals as well as corporate. So I am sorry to say, but I think these are political judgments as much as professional judgments on the part of these otherwise excellent organizations. So having said that and got that out of the way with huge respect to these organizations, let me say these organizations are also wrong because they are interpreting the Genocide Convention according to the 1940s, when the convention was written, and according to the context and meaning of its age. So now, 70 odd years later, in this century, in the succeeding century, as with any law, the meaning of the law and its interpretation evolves. It changes according to the age. What was tolerable in 100 years ago is not so tolerable now. What we understood by something 70 years ago, that meaning and context has changed now. It is no use to us, and Amnesty and Human Rights Watch don't do us any favor at all by interpreting today's happenings according to the laws of the last century. And because if you do that, all you're saying is that you can only look at the present through the perspective of the past, and never can you move forward because your law is always stuck in the past. Even though the ways in which we commit crimes, the ways of thinking, the ways of communicating, the ways of understanding have all changed over the last so many decades. So Amnesty and Human Rights are wrong. Human Rights Watch are wrong in limiting their analysis and understanding to a convention that is just words on a piece of paper, without understanding that those words have evolved and are evolving, even as our world and our humanity evolves with it. So that's my second point. My third point is that, and this is why I mentioned when you asked me what I thought of the report, I said it's a very good report, not because of the level of detail it gives, but because of the overall picture it paints. It's like examining a beautiful picture or a very ugly picture in this particular case. If you were to analyze each little brushstroke of a painter, all you can say is, oh yeah, this is nice green, this is nice red, this is nice blue. But when you see a Picasso or a Van Gogh, what you see is a pattern of overall picture, and you say, hey, this is great, or this is awful, as you like. So the contribution of this report is in building the pattern of what is happening in Tigray. And the modern view of judging genocide is not to prove intent. After all, who is going to be sitting there in Ahmed Ali's office, looking at his correspondence and thinking what's happening in his mind? Today, it's sufficient to infer intent from the pattern of what is happening. And the pattern of what is happening is self-evident, but it is even more evident thanks to these reports, which detail the different types of crimes that are present in it. So I think if you were ever able to get the Ethiopian and Tigray situation into a court of law, the judge of today would interpret the Genocide Convention with the understanding of today's world and infer intent from the evidence of the crimes committed. Not this very narrow legalistic argument of nobody's got a piece of paper, nobody's got, Hitler issued orders which are recorded in the archives. But probably in today's, nobody, even the Ethiopian government is not stupid, though they're pretty stupid. The Ethiopian army is equally stupid, but probably not that stupid to have to record the genocidal orders on paper or on email, right? So we have to move on, and I'm afraid this report fails to do that.
Yeah, actually, you talk about how the Ethiopian government, its officials, its military, even the Eritrean government, how they were actually open in stating their intent on video. No, it's not only, maybe you're right. The old convention may not have, foreseen, that there will be YouTube, there would be video, there would be, Twitter, there would be all these technologies that we have. But there are videos where, officials of the government clearly saying, that we have to wipe out these people.
However,
not only the person, but also their ideas, anything that they have done over the years to erase them from the face of the earth.
That is true. That's what common sense tells us. If for example, the crimes in Tigray were tried not just in a court, but were tried in front of a jury of citizens from around the world. In other words, they were tried not according to the legalistic wisdom of a few judges, but they were tried according to the common sense understanding of ordinary people from the world, who would use their common sense and understanding to get the meanings together. That is what justice is. In the countries we live in many countries, we have trial by jury for a reason. We have trial by jury because we don't want just to be tried by some judge who is stuck in the law book. We want to be tried by our peers who will judge it by the standards of the age we live in. Now, if you were to do that, then I think reasonable people, men and women from around the world, looking at what the pattern is, as mentioned in the report, along with other evidence about what has been said, would conclude that the intention is that of eliminating a people on grounds of their identity, which meets the criteria of a genocide. One of the arguments that I don't buy from this report is that, well, these people are not being eliminated, they are being forcibly displaced. In other words, they've been moved out of Tigray, they become refugees, or they're displaced elsewhere. Now, that doesn't satisfy the criteria of genocide. According to the Genocide Convention, interpretation of Genocide Convention in the eyes of the lawyers who are no doubt been telling these people who have written this report. Well, I'm very sorry, but the Genocide Convention speaks about eliminating a people's way of life. Now, if a bunch of people are removed from their homes, villages, from their neighborhoods, from their friends, from their farms, from their gardens, from their streets, and moved away, and even though they're alive, they're not killed, but they've been removed into the desert in Sudan, or they've been sent away to camps in Addis or elsewhere. Is that not the destruction of a way of life of those people? Because their normal environment, and they have been separated from their normal environment. That's why I think I'm disappointed in the conclusions of this eminent report. Useful as that is, it actually may do us harm. And one of the reasons it might do us harm is because it talks about ethnic cleansing, which is good, but then it talks about ethnic cleansing not a crime. That's what the report also says. It's not a crime because it's not been defined as a crime. And it's not been defined as a crime because nobody in any court with international jurisdiction has actually passed a law saying it's a crime. So just because that hasn't happened doesn't mean to say it's not a crime. It does quote various commissions like in the former Yugoslavia and elsewhere, where slowly the law is evolving and ethnic cleansing is beginning to enter the family of international of crimes, right? It's happening. But how long are we going to wait? We have had many cases of what we call ethnic cleansing around the world, the Rohingyas in Yugoslavia and elsewhere. So are we to wait another 50 years when we have 1,000 more cases, and then we will say, oh yes, this has happened in enough places, on enough times, and therefore we recognize a crime of ethnic cleansing in the same way that we recognize a war crime or as a crime against humanity. Now, we could take that approach. If you happen to be a well-paid lawyer, you would probably carry on, take that approach if you like. You see, this is good money for lawyers, but it has no preventive value. You know, it's no consolation to the people of Tigray to be in the middle of an argument, a legal argument, as to whether their suffering is a crime against humanity, or a crime, or a war crime, or a violation of international humanitarian law, or is genocide. I mean, a woman raped, you know, what difference does it make to her? In what is the characteristic of the rape? Is it rape as part of war crime? Is it rape part of the crime against humanity? Is it rape as part of ethnic cleansing? Is it rape as part of genocide? So I think what I'm saying is that by nitpicking like this, we are being unhelpful. If you're going to use these terms, then I suggest we use all these terms in a comprehensive manner. The other thing in relation to using the word genocide and why I use the term more freely and openly than a lawyer would, if you like, is simply because if we are to have any preventive effect, any early mitigation, it is to use the term in advance. I mean, you are a physician like me, right? So when you have a person in front of you, and that person may have a serious condition, you think, oh, I think this person may have cancer, and therefore you take diagnostic and other actions to diagnose the person with cancer and treat them early. It's no good to the person dying of cancer if you only use the word cancer. Done 6 months of investigations and tests and everything, that by the person is supposed to death. Similarly, what is the point of a report? That is simply telling us what the whole world has known for the last 20 months, even though it's a valuable report, I keep on adding. And it's valuable because we have 100 pages to read now instead of a million tweets and other information and countless journalistic reports. You see. But I'm sorry, this report just stops where it is. It's a job half done, and it is a job that unfortunately leaves us in an unsatisfactory place.
Yeah, thank you, Mukesh. I think you covered the basis that helps in understanding what the report means, how we should be reading it, and what it is missing. That frankly speaking, as I was also reading through it, preparing also for our conversation, that's what I felt. I mean, you see all this, details that pinch your heart, that make you weep, that make you cry, and yet, they couldn't label it to the maximum. As if there is a maximum, in this case, probably genocide, legalistically. So to continue the conversation, because I am just looking at the time. So the other aspect of this, which our viewers are also commenting on, is the response of the international community, and especially, I mean, Ukraine, given all that is happening, deservingly needs all the attention, all the help. But then you have this 16, 17 months of Tigray ongoing genocide, atrocities, a blockade and siege, and the world is not crying as much. I mean, even not 1% of it. And I mean, what surprised me, which I have in this slide, as you can see, is, there was a massacre in Bucha, in Ukraine, and it has been, talked about. Even the U.S. president has talked about it. So what is here? What are we missing? Why are people? Is this to me? I was talking about this as double standard, structural racism, from my background in public health. Uh, where racism actually is one of the 35 top public health priority agenda issues, where we have to fight, we have to address. And in this case, it's very clear, it is very vivid. And it's not only in leaders, it is in institutions, even in our journals, even in our professional associations. You can see it in the open. So I would like to kind of talk about this, why there is this difference in the international reaction. And maybe we could also talk about what are some of the things we could be doing. Maybe if we can impress a little more on some of these leaders and in institutions, both government as well as multilateral organizations. Mukesh.
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this matter in the past few days, because it is only late last night that I returned from the Ukraine region, where I've been seeing the effects of the conflict on the refugees and the assistance that's going into the country, and hearing the stories of the survivors of the atrocities that have been committed in Ukraine. Well, I think there are a number of reasons for this. The first one is that the people of Europe have responded in an extraordinary way to the people of Ukraine, because they are neighbors and because they perceive the situation in Ukraine as a threat to them. Because the neighboring countries have been subjected to fascism and also the cruelties of the Soviet Union in the previous cycle of history. While in the case of Tigray, I don't think Africans care about Tigray. So I'm not sure it's about racism. If there is racism, then I'm afraid Africans are as racist about fellow Africans, in a way. And shame on Africa, and shame on Africans all over the continent. They go on and on about colonialism, they go on and on about white people, etc. Look at the way they vote in the African Union. Look at the way African institutions run by Africans are bringing the lives of Africans, grinding their lives into dust and dirt. So Africans have no right to speak about racism in other continents, if you like, when they themselves are running examples of the intolerance they have in their own continent. And I'm nothing against Africans, on the contrary. The same could be said for my continent of birth, Asia, where Asian intolerance, including in my own country of birth in India, is there, where people turn upon each other or they do not stand for each other. So before we invoke color racism, I think what we find is that a lot of these feelings are there in every country, every community, every continent, in a way. And I'm afraid the biggest obstacle to the world not doing enough on Tigray are Africans themselves. No Africans have gone to the great councils of the world and said, please, let us, we Africans are united, and you help us, because we are part of the same common humanity. And I hope one day you will have a special session and honest examination of that at time. The second reason why no one is helping Tigray much is it's not important in geopolitical terms. Who cares what happens in Tigray? Whether Tigrayans live or die is not going to make a great difference to the world as a whole. And unfortunately, the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong with the world, as said by Paul Farmer, is at the kind of the foundation of all of this. Now, your question, what do we do about this, is a real question you have to ask. And the answer to that is that we must move on from the narrative of being victims to the narrative of empowerment, of solutions, starting with our own selves, in a way. So if you happen to be an African, as you are, then I think it's a question of trying to get the African house in order. And if you happen to be Ethiopian, which you are in your origin, then it's the question of starting from there. And it also means being able to set an internal example, whether it's a domestic example or a continental example, with which to therefore go to the world. The reason Ukraine has got such amazing support from the world is because the Ukrainians are not sitting down doing nothing. They have been at the forefront of resistance. Now, of course, the Tigrayans have been at the forefront of resistance in this civil war and against the genocidal violence from Addis, absolutely. But they have unfortunately not been able to project themselves in the way that Ukrainian leaders have been able to do so. Of course, that is because of circumstances also. The Ukraine was a much richer, more connected, more capacitated country, and you can't compare Tigray and Ukraine directly, absolutely. But then you can't also compare Ethiopian aggression, the Ethiopian internal aggression, against the mighty Russian aggression on Ukraine, right? So once you put all those into context, one begins to understand the differences between in the two particular contexts. My kind of lesson from all of this is that the response to Ukraine context, as I have seen for myself in my recent visit and talking to actors who are helping Ukraine both militarily as well as on the humanitarian side, is that if the aggression and inhumanity, including genocidal acts in Ukraine, can be countered and even reversed, then that is very good news for other situations, especially situations like Tigray, which are hidden from the world to a large extent. So I would kind of look upon the unsatisfactory situation we have in Tigray as a challenge and a stimulus for kind of being more aggressive about trying to address what's going on there. But certainly, I do not think you can trust Ethiopia to continue to have a humanitarian ceasefire and all the rest, because that has clearly failed in the last few days.
Yeah. As we wrap up, Mukesh, you can see from the slides that I put together here. When I read structural racism, you can look at it institutionally. You could look at it from these associations, organizations that we belong to, and you can look at it from the leadership point of view. Here you have Joseph Borrell of the European Union, and you have President Biden of the United States, and you have also the Antonio Guterres, who invited Zelensky to the UN to address the UN on this issue. But if you see any statements that have been made by Mr. Antonio Guterres of the UN over the last several months, I mean, it almost, you wouldn't know there is crimes against humanity to the level of a genocide that's happening in Tigray. You wouldn't know from any of his tweets.
I think Antonio Guterres is not a leader, he's a follower. So if other world leaders say something, he will echo and parrot them. If world leaders or some world leaders say turn left, he will turn left. If they say sit down on your head, he will sit down on his head. So Antonio Guterres is quite useless and is a lost cause. And all we can do is to wait until he goes. Whether or not his successor is any better, of course, only time will tell. But such is the nature of our institutions, global institutions, which are not just hostage to geopolitics, but they're led by cowardly men. But of course, we can say the same thing about the African Union.
Yes, and that is the second point I was going to make was, the African Union, by inaction, by not saying much worse, and of course early on, by supporting the war, faking it as if it is, a police work, a police intervention to Tigray. It has, failed. It has, really failed all it was supposed to do. And in fact, it is, as you know, headquartered in Addis Ababa. And I can imagine the influence of the Ethiopian government, which is next door, on the leaders of the African Union. I mean, there are so many institutions, formal, multilateral, but also local institutions, whether it's the elderly, whether it is the religious community, all this within the Ethiopian community itself that have failed. And you have on top of that, Ethiopian diaspora here in the United States, academicians, doctors, that we have worked together for a long time, in building the health infrastructure of Ethiopia. Well, without saying this is in Tigray, this is in Addis, this is in Hawassa, or this is in Gondar. We have worked everywhere. And these have now sided with one team and supporting, cheering up what has happened in Tigray. So, I mean, I agree with you. The failure, even though we are calling out these higher bodies, whether it is the President of the United States, the UN, the EU, because they have much more leverage than, some of these organizations, including the African Union. I completely agree with you. I think that, actually it hurts much more when you have the closer, entity, the closer community that has failed you when you are, really in danger of extermination as a people. In this case, Tigray, as a people, have been and are still at risk of that extermination unless this blockade and this siege is lifted. And maybe as we conclude, as your last word here, I would like you to just briefly talk about. So the truth has failed, as I talk about it in my take. You have mentioned it too. Um, do you see any way where, I mean, if the Ethiopian government has now actually put additional preconditions where they are asking Afar, the Tigray forces need to leave, Afar need to leave the Amhara area, which is ridiculous in this situation, because Eritrea is still occupying actually Tigray, and they are not asking Eritrea to move out of Tigray at all, or out of Ethiopia. So do you see maybe any panacea that could come out of here, if there are any institutions, governments that should need much more pressure for this truce to work? What should we be looking at, Mukesh?
I think it's not an immediate or an easy solution, but in the same way that not worldwide, but certainly Western sanctions against Russia are reducing its ability to wage war. It's high time that countries started sanctioning the government of Ethiopia and the Ethiopian assets, because wars take place with resources. And the Ethiopian government is using all the resources at its disposal to conduct this conflict. It's not using the resources to look after its own people. And Ethiopia is still a very poor country. And the whole of Ethiopia is suffering. And ordinary people who got nothing to do with war are also suffering because of the actions of their government. But I'm afraid, in the same way that people in Europe are saying that, yes, we are willing to pay heavy price for not importing Russian oil and gas. Yes, we are willing to pay a heavy price in terms of for our bread, because we will not import Russian wheat. The question is whether the Ethiopian people are willing to pay the price for trying to get their government to change course, either by removing that government in some way or by forcing the government in Addis to change course. If that's not going to happen through internal efforts, then good governments and people around the world will have to do it through the only way we know, which is through boycotting Ethiopia. And then the other thing after that is then, of course, we have to support Tigrayan resistance. I mean, in the same way as in Ukraine, I do not think there is any solution to the war in Ukraine unless the Russian aggression is defeated. In the same way, I don't see any solution in the Tigray case unless Eritrea is pushed out militarily and the aggressive forces of the Amhara and the federal forces that have committed these atrocities are also removed in a way. And that, I'm afraid, will only help through Tigrayans taking armed action. Now, people say, when I've said this elsewhere, people say, but you are equating a conflict between two nations, two sovereign nations, which is Russia and Ukraine, and that's between two sovereign nations. And here we're talking about a conflict between a region and a country, in other words, a civil war. How can you equate an international conflict between two nations with a conflict within a nation? And the answer is very, very, very simple. When crimes against humanity are committed, and there is now increasing evidence of the case, and this report has helped us a great deal in consolidating that conclusion, then the distinction between international armed conflicts and domestic armed conflicts is moot, because it's then a war against humanity. And a war against humanity, there are no boundaries, domestic or international. So the same measures that the world is looking at in countering Russian aggression in Ukraine should apply in equal measure, using economic and military means, sanctions as well as the supplying arms, to enable the people of Tigray to resist the crimes against humanity being committed against them by the government of the country of which they are a part.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. I agree with you. I think there has to be, the resistance has to continue definitely, and the diaspora, the Tigrayan diaspora, also has to continue to push. Whether it is governments, multilateral organizations, to make sure that they don't forget about Tigray. Professor Kapila, it is a pleasure to talk to you. I have enjoyed our friendship over the last few years, of the last few months. I am so glad that our paths crossed. I was so glad that your presence was really, part of a huge success in the February Global Health Symposium. And I look forward to working with you and continuing this conversation as we do this program over and until it becomes not important. Yeah, again, thank you so much. And thank you on not only on my behalf, but on behalf of the viewers of IP and Cyber Power of Tigray. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and let the conversation continue. And people of Tigray and of Ethiopia, they should not lose hope or heart, but they should also not be naive. All freedoms in the world by any people have had to be fought for. And unfortunately, history also teaches us that sometimes one also needs to continue to struggle to retain the freedoms that have once been won. Because if you don't do that, then those freedoms are easily lost again. Thank you and good luck.
Amen. Thank you. So I would like to thank our viewers for staying with us. And I have seen a lot of good comments, so we appreciate those comments. We appreciate the questions that you have been forwarding. This is Informed Perspectives.
The humanitarian crisis in northern Ethiopia is growing worse by the day.